Tonight, we will return to the battlefield with stories that most other units would prefer to bury. This is a time to relax, unwind, and slowly listen to the reports that never made it into the official archives. We are heading back to the summer of 1916, specifically to the Picardy region of France, along the banks of the Somme River. You might know it from the history books as one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, a meat grinder of industrial warfare where the air was thick with the scent of cordite and the ground was a churned soup of mud and iron. But beyond the strategic maps and the casualty lists, there were reports from the front line, reports that spoke of things that the high command simply couldn't categorize. The fog that rolled across the Somme that year was just weather. It was a shroud for things that didn't belong to our world. You are a soldier stationed in the Thiepval sector. The environment is one of total, grinding exhaustion. The trenches are narrow, wet, and carved into a landscape that has been stripped of its dignity. The trees that once lined the ridges are now nothing more than splintered, blackened fingers reaching out of the earth. When the shelling pauses, the silence that follows peaceful, it's heavy, pressing against your eardrums like a weight. You sit there, your back against the cold, damp clay, feeling the vibration of distant heavy artillery that seems to pulse like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat deep underground. The mud is everywhere. It's in your boots, under your fingernails, and in the very bread you eat. It is a world of gray and brown, illuminated only by the periodic sickly green glare of a flare drifting over no man and land. The veterans, the few who have survived more than a month in this sector, talk about the ban na bong toy the shadow self. It's an old piece of local folklore the French peasants used to whisper about before the villages were leveled by the 15-inch guns. They said that when death becomes too frequent in one place, the earth begins to forget how to hold onto the souls of the living. They warned that sometimes, a man's shadow might decide to stand up and walk away, or worse, something might come out of the fog and try to borrow a shadow that doesn't belong to it. Most of the fresh replacements laugh it off as shell shock or trench nerves but as you sit on fire watching the Swangmu roll in from the craters, you realize that the logic of the civilized world doesn't apply here. Your unit is maintaining a strict perimeter. The orders are clear, no movement between the lines after 2200 hours, and any silhouette in the fog is to be treated as a hostile threat. You are manning an an observation post, just 20 yards ahead of the main fire step. It's a cramped, miserable hole in the ground covered by a few sheets of corrugated iron and sandbags. Your task is simple: keep your eyes on the grid coordinates provided by the battery commanders and report any unusual activity But unusual has a different meaning out here. It's not just enemy sappers or night raids. It's the way the fog seems to coil around the barbed wire like it's searching for a way in. The air is cold, but it's a damp, clinging cold that bypasses your wool tunic and settles in your bones. You check your watch, but the hands seem to move with agonizing slowness, or sometimes, they seem to jump forward 10 minutes in what felt like a single second. Time is distorted in the trenches. You listen to the radio chatter coming through the field telephone, a low hum of static and voices from other sectors, but occasionally, you hear a voice that doesn't sound like a soldier. It's a voice that mimics the cadence of a British officer or a German sentry, but the words are nonsensical, a string of names and dates that match any roster you've ever seen. You ignore it, chalking it up to atmospheric interference or the sheer psychological strain of the front. You look through your periscope, the glass slightly cracked from a near miss earlier in the day. The moonlight is surprisingly bright tonight, cutting through the thin patches of Swangmu and reflecting off the stagnant water in the shell holes. It creates a landscape of stark contrasts, deep, ink-black shadows and brilliant, bone-white highlights. It is in this play of light and shadow that you start to notice the inconsistencies. You see the silhouettes of the dead, caught in the wire of no man and land, their bodies frozen in the positions they occupied when the machine guns found them. But as the moon moves, their shadows move with them, stretching across the mud like dark, elongated stains. Then you see him. He is standing perfectly still, about 30 yards out, right near a cluster of shattered stumps that used to be a small orchard. He is wearing a standard-issue uniform. You can tell by the cut of the greatcoat, but he has no helmet. He ISN and oppos, T crouching, he ISN and oppos, T seeking cover, and he ISN and oppos, T moving toward either trench. He is just standing there, facing your position, a dark vertical line against the shimmering gray of the fog. You rub your eyes, thinking it's a trick of the light array and quote, stump and quote, you haven and oppos, T noticed before, but you've stared at this same patch of ground for 6 hours every night for a week. You know every inch of those grid coordinates. That man was not there 5 minutes ago. You reach for the field telephone to report a possible enemy scout, but your hand freezes. The moon is directly behind the figure now, casting a harsh, silver light across the mud. Every piece of debris, every scrap of wire, and every corpse in that field is casting a long, distinct shadow toward your trench. But the man standing in the orchard has nothing. The ground beneath his boots is clear, illuminated by the same moonlight that should be creating a dark trail behind him. He is a physical presence, a solid shape that blocks the view of the stumps behind him, yet he casts no shadow. He is a hole in the world, a void where the light simply fails to register. You feel a prickle of sweat on your neck despite the freezing air. This is the Kong Bong the shadowless, that the old French scouts warned you about. You tell yourself it's an optical illusion, a result of the unique atmospheric conditions of the Somme. You try to rationalize it with your military training. Maybe it and oppos, a new type of camouflage, or maybe the angle of the light is just right to hide the shadow in a dip in the ground. But your gut, that primal part of you that hasn't and oppos, been trained by the army, knows better. You feel a sense of being watched, not by a pair of eyes, but by the entire environment. The forest of stumps seems to lean toward you, and the fog begins to thicken around the base of the shadowless man, obscuring his feet. You pull your rifle closer, the cold steel of the bolt action reassuring against your palm.
You don't yapos, defies.
You wait, your breath coming in shallow hitches that bloom in the air like small clouds of smoke. The figure doesn't and oppos, move, but you get the distinct impression that he is waiting too. He is waiting for you to look away, or waiting for the fog to bridge the gap between the orchard and your wire. The silence of the Somme has never felt so loud. The shadowless figure in the orchard remained a silent sentinel, but as you stepped back from the periscope, the immediate threat began to shift from the distant horizon to the very air inside your trench. In the Somme, you quickly learned that the enemy ISN and oppos, always across no man and oppos, land. Sometimes, the enemy is the environment itself, a landscape so traumatized by steel and fire that it begins to manifest its own collective trauma. You move along the traverse, your boots sinking into the thick anaerobic mud that clings to your soles with a desperate, wet grip. This is the inner sanctum of the front, a world of narrow passages and damp dugouts where the sun rarely reaches and the moonlight only serves to sharpen the jagged edges of the splintered timber. As you approach the intersection of the primary fire trench and a communication line, designated on your maps as grid coordinate 44B, you notice the first anomaly.
The silence.
It ISN and oppos, the silence of a sleeping camp, but a pressurized artificial quiet that seems to have swallowed all natural sound. Usually, the trenches are alive with the sound of the Somme, the distant thud of artillery, the scratching of fat, well-fed rats behind the revetments, and the rhythmic drip of water into stagnant pools. Now, everything has stopped. Even the wind, which had been whistling through the torn wire moments ago, has vanished. It feels as though the world has held its breath, waiting for something to happen. You're joined by a fellow soldier, a man we'll call Elias. Elias is a veteran of the Gallipoli campaign, a man who has seen the worst of what human conflict can offer and has developed a skin as thick as leather. He is sitting on a low crate, cleaning his service rifle by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle stuck into a niche in the chalk wall. He doesn't and oppos, look up as you approach, but you see his shoulders are tense. He pauses his rhythmic scrubbing, his head tilting slightly to the side. He is listening to something you haven and oppos, T yet heard. Then it begins.
A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the darkness of the communication trench behind you. Tap, tap, tap.
It's the sound of something hard hitting the wooden duckboards.
ITSN et apos. T'es the heavy, rolling of a soldier in full kit.
It and oppos. S too light, too precise, and lacks the wet squelch of mud that should accompany any movement in this sector. It sounds more like the tip of a cane or a bone striking the timber. End quote. You hear that? End quote. Elias whispers, his voice dry and devoid of its usual gruff confidence. He has Ndapos, T moved, but his grip on the rifle has tightened until his knuckles are white. You nod, though your throat feels like it's been lined with sand.
The sound is coming closer. Tap, tap, tap.
It is steady, unhurried, as if whatever is making the noise knows exactly where you are and has no fear of being discovered.
You reach for your torch, the heavy brass casing cold in your hand.
You flick the switch, and a weak beam of yellow light cuts through the swangmu that has started to spill over the parapet. The beam dances across the walls of the trench, shredded sandbags, rotting timber, and the pale ghost-white chalk of the French earth. You aim the light down the communication trench, expecting to see a runner or perhaps a stray dog from one of the nearby ruins. There is nothing. The trench is empty. The light illuminates the puddles of brown water and the slick surface of the duckboards, but there is no one there. Yet, as soon as you lower the torch, the sound starts again.
Tap, tap, tap.
This time it's closer, perhaps only 10 feet away, just around the bend of the next traverse. The hair on your arms stands up. It's not just the sound, it's the sensation of a physical presence, a weight in the air that was Ndapos, T there before. It feels like the air has become thicker, harder to breathe, and smells faintly of ozone and old dry dust, a scent that has no business being in a wet trench in Picardy. End quote. Stay low, end quote. Elias commands, his training finally overriding his fear. He slides around into the chamber of his rifle. The metallic clack bolts sound usually a comfort, but now it feels disturbingly loud in the artificial silence. He positions himself at the corner of the traverse, ready to confront whatever is coming.
You follow him, your own hammering against your rib like a trapped bird.
The tapping stops. It stops exactly at the point where the person or thing should be visible to you.
You both stare into the darkness.
There is no heavy breathing, no rustle of fabric, no scent of tobacco or sweat that usually identifies a fellow soldier. Instead, there is a sudden drop in temperature. Your breath begins to bloom in front of you in thick white clouds, even though it's a relatively mild night for 1916. Then from the darkness, a voice speaks. It isn and oppos, a scream or a growl. It's a whisper, but it sounds like it's being projected from everywhere at once. It's a voice that mimics the cadence of your own commanding officer, but the words are wrong. And quote, report your shadow, private. Give it here. It's too heavy for the mud.
Give it here. Echo.
Elias swings around the corner, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. You flash the torch again, the beam sweeping the narrow corridor of the communication trench. Again, there is nothing.
No intruder, no prankster, no enemy scout.
But on the chalk wall, just where the light hits, you see something that makes your blood turn to ice.
Your own shadow, cast against the waters by the torch, is flickering.
It isn and oppos, T moving in sync with your body. As you stand perfectly still, frozen in terror, your shadow is slowly reaching out its hand toward the darkness of the trench floor, as if it's trying to detach itself from your boots. Elias sees it too. He drops his rifle, the weapon clattering onto the duckboards. He isn and oppos, T looking at the empty trench anymore, he's looking at the ground behind you. He points a trembling finger at the space where his own shadow should be.
Under the flickering candle light, the floor beneath Elias is blank.
His body is solid, he is standing right there, but the light passes through the space where his shadow should be as if he were made of glass. He has no shadow. The silence returns, deeper than before, and the tapping sound starts again, but this time, it's coming from above you on the parapet. Elias stood there, his boots planted firmly on the wooden duckboards, but the ground beneath him was an impossible, uniform gray. The candle in the niche flickered, casting light on the chalk walls, the discarded mess tins, and the mud, but it refused to acknowledge his presence. He was a solid man, a veteran of the Dardanelles who had survived shrapnel and dysentery, yet in this pocket of the Somme, he had become a ghost before his time. The tapping from the parapet above continued, a rhythmic, dry sound like a finger bone drummed against a crate, and we both knew that whatever was up there was looking down, waiting for the rest of us to notice what it had already taken. And quote, "Get to the dugout," and quote, I whispered, my voice sounding thin and metallic in my own ears. I didn't oppose. Want to touch him. It was a shameful, instinctive reaction, but there was a part of my mind that feared his condition was contagious, that by brushing against his wool sleeve, my own shadow might slide off and join the darkness. Elias didn't oppose. Move at first. He was staring at the space where his shadow should have been with a look of profound existential confusion. It wasn't oppose. The look of a man in pain. It was the look of a man who had suddenly realized he was no longer part of the equation of the living. Finally, he blinked, the military discipline kicking back in through the haze of shock, and he followed me as we retreated into the deeper recesses of the trench line. We ducked into a reinforced dugout designated for the scouts of the 12th Territorial. It was a low-ceilinged hole, braced with heavy timber that groaned under the weight of the churned earth above. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the earthy bitter scent of the Picardy chalk. In the corner, hunched over a small brazier of glowing charcoal, sat Baptiste. He was a local, a Frenchman from a nearby village that had long since been pulverized into white dust by the guns of both sides. He served as a guide and a laborer, one of those men who seemed to belong more to the soil of France than to any particular army. He didn't oppose. Look up when we entered, but his eyes, dark and sunken, were fixed on the floor at Elias's feet. And quote, "He is already gone," end quote, Baptiste said in a low, gravelly voice, his French-accented English barely audible over the distant, muffled thud of the 9.2-inch howitzers. He didn't oppose. Say and oppose, he is dead. And oppose, he said and oppose, he is gone. And oppose. I pulled a stool over, my hands still shaking as I tried to light a cigarette. And quote, "He's standing right there, Baptiste. He's tired, he's rattled, but he's right there. Tell us what we saw. Tell us about the tapping on the parapet." And quote, Baptiste finally looked at me, and I saw a flicker of genuine pity in his gaze. He began to speak of the folklore of this region, the end quote, Ban na bong toi end quote, the shadow self, but his version was darker than the stories told by the old women in the villages. He explained that in Picardy, the earth is old, and it has a memory that stretches back long before the first shovel hit the ground in 1914. He told us that when a place sees too much blood, when the soil is saturated with the final breaths of thousands of men, the boundary between the end quote, here end quote, and the end quote, somewhere else end quote, begins to fray like a rotted uniform. End quote, "The land is hungry," end quote, Baptiste whispered, leaning closer to the charcoal. End quote, "The Somme has been fed too much iron and too little peace. When the Swangmu comes, it is not just water and air. It is the breath of the things that live in the gaps.
Dei arze e apos, kaemen bong e apos, the shadow borrower.
They have no shape of their own, no weight in this world. They are the echoes of the men who died so fast they forgot to leave. To walk here, to stay here, they need a tether. They need a shadow." End quote. He pointed a gnarled finger at Elias, who had slumped against the timber wall, his eyes glazed and distant. End quote. "They take the shadow first to see if it fits. If the man is weak, if his soul is fragmented by the noise of the guns, the shadow peels away like bark from a dead tree. Once they have the shadow, they have the map of the man. They know his name, his face, the way he walks. And then they come for the rest." End quote.
Elias let out à l'omoan, a sound of ute exhaustion.
End quote. "It felt cold," end quote, he muttered, his voice barely a breath. End quote, like something reached behind my eyes and pulled a cord.
I feel light, sergent.
I feel like if the wind caught me, I'd just drift over the wire and never come down. End quote.
Baptiste shook his head slowly.
End quote. Do not let him sleep, end quote, he warned me. End quote. In sleep, the tether is weakest. If he sleeps without his shadow, the thing that is tapping on our roof will find its way in. It is following the scent of the missing piece. It is looking for the body that matches the shadow it now wears. End quote. The reality of our situation began to settle over me like the very fog Baptiste described. We were in a high-intensity combat zone, surrounded by millions of tons of high explosives and tens of thousands of armed men, yet the greatest threat was something that didn't oppose, have a pulse or a uniform. I looked at the ceiling of the dugout. The tap-tap-tap had stopped, replaced by a soft, slithering sound, as if something heavy and wet was being dragged across the timber and sandbags directly above our heads. End quote. This ISN and oppose, shell shock, end quote, I whispered more to myself than to the others. I had seen men break under the pressure of the barrage.
Yatsin et apos, the 200 yard star et apos, and the incontrôlable tremor of the nervous system.
But this was different. This was a physical subtraction.
I shaked my own shadow by the light of the brazier.
It was there, dark and distorted against the dirt floor, but it seemed to be shivering, its edges blurred and jagged, as if it were trying to pull away from my boots. Baptiste reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blackened piece of wood, a fragment of a lightning-struck oak from the nearby high wood. He handed it to me. End quote. The old ones say that the shadow is the anchor of the spirit. Without it, you are just a vessel waiting to be filled. If your friend loses his grip, the thing outside will not kill him. It will simply walk away in his skin, and he will be left here, a silent part of the swung move forever. End quote. I looked at the piece of wood and then at Elias, who was starting to nod off, his chin dropping to his chest. The silence in the dugout was absolute, broken only by the settling of the earth and the distant rhythmic thud of the war. But beneath those sounds, I could hear a new one, a voice faint and distorted, coming from just outside the dugout and oppose, heavy wool curtain. It was calling Elias's name. It sounded exactly like his mother, a woman who lived 300 miles away in a quiet village in Sussex. End quote, Elias, end quote, the voice whispered sweet and clear through the stench of the trench.
Echo, come out, Elias. The sun is up.
It's time to come home. End quote. Elias's eyes snapped open, but they weren't and oppose, his eyes anymore. They were flat, reflecting the red glow of the charcoal with a dull metallic sheen. He began to stand up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He wasn't oppose, looking at us. He was looking at the curtain, at the darkness beyond, where his shadow was waiting for him to step into it. The voice calling Elias's name from behind the dugout curtain was a weapon, precision engineered to bypass a soldier's mental fortifications. It had the cadence of home, the warmth of a kitchen fire, and the gentle pull of a memory that hadn't oppose, been scarred by the psalm. Baptiste was faster than I was. He lunged forward, not to grab Elias, but to press that blackened piece of lightning-struck oak against the man's bare neck. The reaction was instantaneous. Elias let out a sharp, choked gasp, and the red metallic light in his eyes vanished, replaced by the dull, hollow stare of a man who had just woken up from a nightmare only to find himself in a worse one. He collapsed back onto the mud-slicked floor, his chest heaving. The voice outside didn't oppose, scream or protest. It simply dissolved into a low, wet chortle that sounded like air escaping a punctured lung, and then there was only the sound of the swung moose swirling against the timber. By 2 o'clock hours, the order came down the line for a localized sweep of the sector. The brass at HQ had received reports of enemy infiltration near grid coordinate 44B, and despite the eerie events in the dugout, the war didn't oppose, stop for ghost stories. I was paired with Private Klaus, a man who had been transferred to our unit from a scout sniper detachment. Klaus was a quiet man, the kind of soldier who moved through the trenches like a shadow himself, his eyes always scanning the horizon, his movements economical and precise. He didn't oppose. T asked about Elias, who was being held in the medical bay under observation but I could tell by the way Klaus checked his Henderson Field and adjusted his webbing that he knew the night was far from normal. We moved out of the fire trench and into the sap, a shallow, narrow extension that poked its way into no man and Oppo's land. The environment here was a sensory deprivation chamber. The Swangmu had thickened into a soup of grayish-white vapor that smelled of wet chalk and something metallic, like old blood mixed with copper. Visibility was down to less than 5 yards. You couldn't see the stars, and the moonlight was filtered through the mist, creating a flat, directionless glow that made every hummock of earth look like a crouching man. Klaus led the way, his rifle held at the ready, his feet making almost no sound on the churned-up earth. We were operating on a strict no radio chatter policy, relying on hand signals and the occasional whispered word. Hold Klaus whispered, his hand going up in a flat palm. We were near the edge of the orchard stumps, the same area where I had seen the shadowless figure through the periscope. The air here was colder, a localized pocket of frost that seemed to ignore the calendar. Klaus knelt down, his eyes fixed on a patch of relatively fresh mud that hadn't yet been trampled by the night and Oppo's earlier movements. He gestured for me to bring the torch, but to keep the beam low and shielded by my hand.
He clicked the lighton, a sliver of yellow cutting through the mist.
The ground here was a canvas of the war and Oppo's brutality, shards of shell casings, shredded bits of a wool tunic, and the calcified remains of a fence post. But in the center of a patch of pale gray mud, there were prints. Klaus pointed at them with the tip of his trench knife. They were clear, deep impressions of a standard-issue hobnailed boot, the kind worn by almost every soldier on this front. But as I traced the trail with the light, the hair on the back of my neck began to rise. The tracks didn't make sense. In any normal gait, you see a left foot followed by a right, the stride length consistent with a man's height and the weight of his kit. These prints were different. There was no left foot. There was no right foot. There was only a single repeated impression of the same boot, a right side boot, landing one after the other in a perfectly straight line. It was as if a one-legged man was hopping across no man and Oppo's land, but the depth of the impression suggested a weight far greater than a single man could carry. The stride was enormous, nearly 4 feet between each mark, and there were no signs of a crutch or a cane to balance the weight. Look at the edges Klaus muttered, his voice barely a tremor.
He leaned closer.
The edges of the footprints were sharp, as if the boot had been pressed into the mud with mechanical precision. But there was something missing. In this damp environment, even the lightest step leaves a halo of disturbed moisture or a splash of liquid mud around the rim. These prints were bone dry. The mud inside the impression was cracked and parched, as if the heat of the foot that made it had instantly evaporated every drop of water in the soil. It was a trail of burnt earth in the middle of a swamp. The tracks led away from our lines, heading toward the center of no man and Oppo's land, toward a massive shell crater that the men called the devil and Oppo's throat. We followed the trail, our pulses thundering in our ears. The Swangmu seemed to part for the tracks, as if the mist itself was afraid to touch them. Every 10 yards, the tracks would stop, and the mud would be churned up in a circle, as if the thing had stood there and spun around, looking for something. Or someone. Suddenly, Klaus stopped. He wasn't Oppo's looking at the ground anymore. He was looking at a splintered tree stump just ahead. Hanging from a jagged shard of wood was a piece of fabric. It was a strip of a greatcoat, torn and ragged. I recognized the weave. It was the same material as Elias's coat. But Elias's coat had been intact when we left him at the medical bay. I reached out to touch the fabric, but Klaus grabbed my wrist. Don and Oppo's he hissed. Look at the stump. Behind the fabric, carved into the dead wood of the stump with what looked like a bayonet, were the grid coordinates of our own observation post. Below the numbers, a single word had been etched in a cramped archaic script, muon, borrowed.
The realisation it me like a physical blow.
The and quote, thing in quote, wasn't and oppose, just wandering, it was cataloging. It was marking its territory, and it was using the identity of our men to do it. The single-legged tracks didn't and oppose, represent a physical gait, they represented a partial manifestation. The and quote, kumuon bong in quote, was still building itself, using the pieces of shadow and memory it had scavenged from Elias. It was a half-formed thing, dragging itself through our reality, leaving a trail of dead, dry earth in its wake. A sound echoed from the direction of the devil and Oppo's throat, a low metallic scraping, like a shovel being dragged over a sheet of iron. It was followed by a voice. It wasn't and Oppo's, the voice of a mother this time. It was Klaus's voice. It was coming from the darkness ahead of us, clear and distinct, calling out a sit-rep that we hadn't and Oppo's, even reported yet. And quote, Sector 44 be clear, and quote, the voice of Klaus drifted through the Swang Mu. And quote, requesting permission to return to the perimeter. I have found the missing piece. And quote. Klaus, standing right next to me, went pale. He slowly raised his rifle, aiming into the void where his own voice was coming from. The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever experienced. We were standing in the middle of a graveyard, and the dead were starting to use our own tongues to speak. The sound of Klaus's own voice echoing back at him from the lightless depths of the Swangmu was a psychological breach that no amount of basic training could prepare a man for. It wasn't Oppo's, just a mimicry. It was a perfect sonic replica, containing the same slight rasp from years of heavy tobacco use and the subtle Bavarian inflection he tried so hard to hide. Klaus didn't and Oppo's move. He stood like a statue of salt, his Henderson Field leveled at the shifting wall of gray. I could hear his teeth grinding together, a dry rhythmic sound that was the only proof he hadn't and Oppo's turned to stone. We were standing in the dead center of the grid coordinates, a place where the map became a lie and the compass needle spun with a frantic, aimless energy. And quote, Don and Oppo's move and quote, I breathed, the words barely more than a vibration in my throat. I reached for my flares, but my fingers felt numb, as if the cold of the orchard had seeped through my gloves and frozen the very nerves beneath the skin. The Swangmu wasn't and Oppo's just drifting anymore. It was swirling in localized eddies, as if something massive and invisible was moving through it, displacing the air with every silent step. The smell of the trenches, the rot, the cordite, the lime, was gone. In its place was that sterile dry scent of ancient dust, a smell that belonged in a tomb that hadn't and Oppo's been open for 1,000 years. The voice spoke again, but this time it was closer. Much closer.
Echo. Klaus?
Is that you? I can and Oppo's see the perimeter.
The light, it's wrong point echo.
Klaus's breathing became a series of short, sharp hitches. He began to track something with his muzzle, moving the barrel of his rifle in a slow, agonizing arc from left to right. I followed his gaze, squinting until my eyes ached. Through a momentary thinning of the fog, about 15 yards ahead, a silhouette emerged. It was leaning against the shattered remains of a Mark I tank, a rusted hulk of iron that had become a landmark in this sector of the Somme. The figure was slumped, one arm draped over the sponson, the other hanging limp at its side. It wore the charcoal-gray greatcoat of our unit. It had the same slouch as Klaus, the same way of tilting the head to the left when tired. And quote, identity yourself. And quote, I barked, my voice cracking under the strain. My hand finally found the flare pistol, the heavy brass grip a cold comfort. The figure didn't and Oppo's respond with words. Instead, it slowly stood up. It didn't and Oppo's push itself off the tank. It simply unfolded, its limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural fluidness, like a film being played at the wrong speed. As it stepped into a patch of filtered moonlight, the horror of the end quote, one boot and quote, trail became visceral. The entity was solid, yes, but it was incomplete. Its left side was a blurred smudge of gray vapor, as if the world hadn't quite finished rendering its form. But its right side, the side that matched the single tracks we had found, was terrifyingly detailed. Every button on the tunic, every stitch in the wool, every scratch on the leather of the boot was hyperreal, more vivid than the man standing right next to me. But it was the face that stayed with me. It was Klaus's face, but it was like a mask made of wet clay that had started to slide. The features were there, the nose, the eyes, the thin line of the mouth, but they were shifted a few inches to the right, leaving a smooth, featureless expanse of skin on the left side of the skull. And where the eyes should have reflected the silver light of the moon, there was only a dull, matte blackness.
Echo, shoot, echo, he whispered. Echo, Klaus, fire. Echo.
Klaus had his finger on the trigger. I saw the muscle in his forearm tighten.
He saw the hammer cock back.
But he couldn't do it. His whole body began to shake, a violent rhythmic tremor that rattled the sling of his rifle against the wooden stock.
It was neapos, te cowardis.
It was something deeper, a biological refusal to destroy what the brain perceived as its own self. To pull that trigger was to commit a form of spiritual suicide. The entity seemed to know this. It began to walk toward us, that heavy, dry thump of the right boot hitting the mud with the force of a hammer, while the left side of its body trailed behind like smoke in a breeze. As it approached, the air around us became impossibly heavy. It felt like walking into a wall of water. My lungs burned as I tried to draw breath, and the sounds of the distant war, the constant comforting thud of the artillery, faded into a high-pitched whine that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. The entity stopped 5 yards away. It reached out its solid, right hand. It was Nandapo's, reaching for Klaus's throat. It was reaching for his chest, specifically for the area where a man's heart beats. And I am Klaus, the entity said. The voice didn't Nandapo's, come from its mouth. It radiated from the air itself, a vibration that felt like it was originating inside my own skull. And I have the shadow. I have the name. Now I need the weight. And the Swangmu surged, a wall of white vapor that completely swallowed the entity and Klaus. I was suddenly alone in a world of blinding gray. I heard a struggle, the sound of fabric tearing, the wet slap of hands on mud, and then a sound that I can only describe as a long, slow peel like a bandage being ripped off a wound that had Nandapo's healed. I fired the flare pistol. The thump of the launch was followed by a blinding magnesium-white glare that hung in the air, illuminating the fog from within. The light revealed a scene I will never forget. Klaus was on his knees, his head thrown back in a silent scream. Standing over him was the entity, but it had changed. It was no longer a blurred smudge. It was becoming more solid, more defined, as if it were drinking the very essence of the man below it. Klaus's uniform was turning a dull, flat gray, the color draining out of the fabric and into the thing that stood over him. And Klaus's shadow, the dark patch on the mud that had been his anchor, was being pulled upward, stretching and twisting like taffy until it merged with the boots of the entity.
I reste my own rifle, my vision blurred by the harsh light of the flare.
I aimed for the entity's head, that distorted, clay-like mask. My fingers squeezed the trigger. The Henderson Field barked, a roar that shattered the artificial silence of the sector. The recoil kicked into my shoulder, a familiar grounding pain. But the bullet didn't Nandapo's strike flesh. It passed through the entity as if it were nothing more than a trick of the light, punching a hole in the mud 30 yards behind it. The entity turned its head toward me. For a fraction of a second, the mask shifted, and I saw what lay beneath the borrowed face.
There was nothing.
No bone, no blood, just a swirling vortex of the same Swangmu that covered the psalm, a void that was hungry for everything that had a name and a shadow. It didn't Nandapo's attack. It didn't Nandapo's need to. The flare sputtered and died, plunging us back into a darkness so thick it felt like being buried alive. When the next flare from the main line went up, minutes later, the entity was gone. Klaus was still on his knees, but he was silent. He didn't oppose. Look at me when I approached. He just stared at his hands that were now as pale and translucent as the fog itself. And when I looked at the ground, I saw that Klaus was no longer alone in his condition. His shadow was gone, and in its place was a single dry footprint, right where the entity had stood. The walk back from the orchard to the primary fire trench should have taken no more than 6 minutes at a standard tactical pace. I had Klaus by the arm, his gait heavy and dragging, his boots making a sound like wet leather being slapped against cold stone. He was physically present. I could feel the rough wool of his sleeve, yet he felt strangely weightless, as if the density of his soul had been siphoned away along with his shadow. The Swangmu was no longer a passive weather event. It had become an active participant in our retreat, coiling around our legs and obscuring the very duckboards beneath our feet. I looked down at my watch, a standard-issue trench watch with a protective grille. The luminous paint on the hands glowed a sickly radioactive green in the gloom. It was 2:45. We continued to move, navigating the zigzag turns of the communication trench. After what felt like at least 15 minutes of strenuous exertion, I checked the watch again. The hands hadn't oppose. Moved. It was still 2:45. I tapped the glass, thinking the mainspring had snapped from the cold, but the ticking was audible, a frantic metallic heartbeat that seemed to be accelerating even as the hands remained frozen. End quote. Klaus, how long have we been walking? End quote, I whispered. He didn't oppose. Answer. He was staring at his own wrist. His watch wasn't oppose. Just frozen. The hands were spinning counterclockwise at a blurring speed, the mechanism whining under the friction. Time in the psalm was no longer a linear progression. It was folding in on itself, becoming a stagnant pool where the past and the present were beginning to merge. We reached a junction that should have led to the company HQ dugout, but the landmarks were wrong. The revetments weren't oppose. Made of timber and sandbags anymore. They were walls of packed dry earth that smelled of ancient decay, and the grid coordinates painted on the signpost were symbols I didn't oppose. Recognize. We stumbled upon a forward signal relay station, a small cramped alcove carved into the chalk wall.
Inside sat the signalé, Private Miller.
He was wearing his headphones, his back to us, hunched over a D Mark III field telephone. The candle in the room was burning with a steady blue flame that cast no heat. Miller was scribbling furiously in his logbook, the pencil lead snapping and scratching against the paper.
Echo, Miller.
We need a medic for Klaus, end quote. I barked, relief flooding through me at the sight of another living soul. Miller didn't oppose. Turn around. He didn't oppose. Even flinch. I walked over and grabbed his shoulder, but he felt as cold and rigid as a piece of artillery iron. I pulled the headphones off his ears, and that oppose. When I heard it. The field telephone wasn't oppose. Connected to anything. The copper wire had been severed and was lying in a useless heap on the floor. Yet, the headphones were alive with radio chatter. It wasn't oppose. The usual military code or the frantic reports of a night raid. It was a cacophony of voices, all of them familiar, all of them speaking at once in a terrifying, overlapping weave. I heard my own voice, from Section 1, describing the shadowless man in the orchard. I heard Elias and Oppo's voice, crying out for his mother. And then, I heard a voice that made the marrow in my bones vibrate. It was the voice of our lieutenant, a man who had been vaporized by a direct hit from a 5.9-inch shell 3 weeks prior. End quote. All units be advised, end quote. The dead lieutenant's voice crackled through the static, sounding as clear as if he were standing right behind me. End quote. The perimeter has been breached from below. Do not look at the ground. Your shadows are no longer authorized equipment. If you see your shadow moving independently, you are to treat it as a hostile combatant. I repeat, the ground is hungry.
Terminatal connexion to your own silhouette echo.
I dropped the headphones. They hit the floor with a dull thud, but the voices continued to leak out of them, a whispered tide of warnings and pleas from men who were no longer among the living. Miller finally turned his head. His face was a mask of utter vacancy, his eyes rolled back so that only the whites showed. He was Ndapos, breathing, yet he began to speak, his mouth moving in perfect synchronization with the radio chatter. End quote. The time is 02:45, end quote, Miller's body said, using the lieutenant's authoritative tone. End quote. It will always be 2:45 until the borrowing is complete. End quote.
I baquet de way, pulling the transluce, shadowless Klaus with me.
We ran. We ran through trenches that seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls narrowing until our shoulders scraped against the rough chalk. The Swangmu was now glowing with a faint internal luminescence, illuminating the dead bodies caught in the wire above us. But the bodies were in Ndapos, still. They were twitching, their limbs jerking in time with the ticking of my frozen watch. Every time we passed a puddle, I looked away, terrified of what I might see, or what I might not see. The feeling of being watched had evolved into a physical pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The Kumuanbong was Ndapos, just one entity anymore. It felt like the entire sector was waking up, a collective consciousness of the forgotten dead trying to claw their way back into the light by stealing the reflections of the living. We reached a heavy wool curtain that I hoped led to the main barracks. I tore it aside, expecting to see the faces of my squad, the smell of bacon and greasy rifles. Instead, I found myself back in the orchard. The same shattered stumps.
The Sam Rosted Marquitank.
And there, standing exactly where he had been before, was the entity wearing Klaus's face. I looked at my watch again.
2:45.
The entity smiled. It was a slow, agonizing movement that split the clay-like skin of its borrowed face. It raised its hand, and this time, it was Ndapos, holding a weapon. It was holding a pocket watch, Elias's watch. It clicked the winding key, and as it did, the Swangmu around us began to solidify into the shapes of men. They were soldiers, hundreds of them, standing in perfect formation across no man Ndapos' land. They were all silent. They were all motionless. And as the moon broke through the clouds, I realized with a jolt of pure horror that not a single one of them cast a shadow on the moonlit mud. The loop had closed. We were in Ndapos, retreating, we were being gathered. The Somme was Ndapos, just a battlefield, it was a harvest. The moonlight that night was a traitor. In any other theater of war, a clear sky and a bright moon were a soldier Ndapos' only reprieve from the crushing claustrophobia of the trenches, a chance to see the enemy before the bayonet found its mark. But at the Somme, under the jurisdiction of the Swangmu, the light had been co-opted. It was no longer a tool for observation, it was a spotlight for a diagnostic search. As I stood frozen in that orchard of splintered stumps, the silver glare from above felt invasive, cutting through the thin veil of the fog to highlight the absolute wrongness of the figure standing before me. Klaus was beside me, or at least the physical shell of him was. He was leaning against a shattered apple tree, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, but he was no longer checking his perimeter. He was looking at the moon with a vacant, adoring expression, his eyes reflecting the silver light like two polished coins. I looked down at his feet. The mud was illuminated with a clarity that felt artificial, every ripple in the silt and every shard of shrapnel casting a sharp black shadow, except for Klaus. He stood in a pool of flat, gray emptiness. The light simply passed through the space where his shadow should have been, as if he had become a pane of frosted glass. I turned my gaze back to the army in no man Ndapos' land. They were arranged in perfect, silent ranks, stretching across the grid coordinates of our sector. By the cut of their uniforms, I could see they were a mix of every unit that had bled into this soil since July. There were British Tommies with their flat Brodie helmets, French poilus in faded horizon blue, and German Lancer in their coal-scuttle Stahlhelms. In life, they would have been trying to kill each other with every ounce of industrial ingenuity available to the modern world. In this half-light, they stood shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of the stolen. None of them had shadows. The moon was high now, positioned perfectly to cast long dramatic silhouettes toward our secondary lines, but the ground beneath those hundreds of men was as clear as a fresh sheet of paper. It was a visual paradox that the human brain struggled to process. My eyes kept trying to draw the shadows in, to force the logic of physics onto the scene, but the reality refused to comply. They were the Kumuanbong, the shadowless ones, the byproduct of a land that had forgotten the difference between a casualty report and a soul. The entity wearing Klaus and Apo's face, the one I had shot at earlier, stepped forward from the front rank. Its movements were no longer jerky. It had stabilized, its form becoming dense and hyper-detailed as it finished integrating the borrowed essence it had taken from Klaus. It looked more like Klaus than Klaus did. It adjusted the strap of its stolen rifle with a familiarity that was nauseating. It didn't speak with its mouth. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed the ears and landed directly in the prefrontal cortex. The light is hungry for a match, the vibration whispered. A man without a shadow is a man without a weight. A man without a weight is just a memory. And memories belong to the Swang Mu. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my heels. I looked down and gasped. My own shadow, usually a faithful distorted companion on the mud, was flickering violently. It wasn't Apo's reacting to the moonlight, it was reacting to the presence of the shadowless army. It was pulling away from my boots, the edges fraying and stretching toward the entity in front of me. It felt like someone was trying to peel the skin off the bottom of my feet with a dull knife. The psychological pressure was immense, a sense of being hollowed out while still alive. I reached for my trench knife, the handle slick with cold sweat, but my hand felt heavy, as if the gravity of the world was concentrating specifically on my remaining shadow. I realized then that the moonlight wasn't Apo's just exposing us, it was the medium through which the borrowing occurred. The light was the solvent that loosened the bond between the man and his silhouette. Stop looking at them. I shouted at myself, though the words came out as a strangled groan. I tried to retreat, to move back into the deeper darkness of a nearby dugout, but the Swang Mu had solidified into a wall of white vapor that felt as solid as concrete. I was trapped in a circle of light, a laboratory specimen under the lunar microscope. Across the field, the ranks of shadowless soldiers began to move. They didn't march, they drifted, their feet making that terrifying dry thump sound I had heard in the communication trench. It was the sound of 1,000 right boots hitting the earth simultaneously, with no corresponding sound from the left. The rhythm was hypnotic, a pulse that matched the frantic frozen ticking of my watch. Thump, thump, thump. They were closing in, a slow-motion tidal wave of gray wool and bone-white faces. I looked at Klaus. He was still smiling at the moon, completely indifferent to the fact that his replacement was now leading an army toward us. He was the first of the harvest, and I was intended to be the next. I fumbled for a phosphorus grenade in my webbing, my fingers clumsy and numb. If the moonlight was the problem, I needed a different kind of light, a light so bright and chaotic that it would break the diagnostic hold of the moon. But as I pulled the pin, the entity wearing Klaus and Apo's face looked directly at me. Its matte black eyes seemed to absorb the very sparks from the fuse. You cannot burn what is already cold, the voice vibrated. The shadowless army stopped just 10 yards away. The moonlight intensified, the silver glow becoming so bright it was painful to look at. And in that blinding brilliance, I saw the truth of what was happening beneath the soil of the Somme. The earth wasn't Apo's just eating the dead, it was recycling them into something that could walk in the Swang Mu without ever needing to rest. I was the only thing in the entire grid coordinate that still cast a shadow, and to them, I was a glaring, intolerable inconsistency in their perfect gray world. The retreat from the orchard back to the observation post, was not a movement through space, but a crawl through a fever dream of white vapor and silver light. I dragged Klaus with me, his body feeling less like a man and more like a bag of dry leaves, weightless and brittle. We reached the that cramped sandbagged hole at grid coordinate 44b, and I practically threw him into the corner, away from the moonlight that was still trying to dissolve what little was left of his identity. I needed the safety of the earth, the reassurance of the chalk walls and the timber braces, but the OP had transformed into a cage. The Swangmu had followed us, pouring over the lip of the trench like milk, filling the space until I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I took my position at the periscope, my fingers trembling as I gripped the cold brass handles. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I possessed, from my basic training to the primal survival mechanisms of my ancestors, told me to close my eyes and wait for the sun. But a soldier on fire watch doesn't oppose. Have the luxury of blindness.
I pressed my eyes to the glass.
The army of the shadowless was still out there, but they weren't oppose. Marching anymore. They were standing perfectly still, hundreds of them, their forms silhouetted against the glowing fog. And in the very center of my field of vision, only 5 yards from the OP and Oppo's wire was the entity. It was the same one, the thing that wore Klaus's face like a poorly fitted mask. It was standing completely motionless, its arms hanging straight at its sides, its feet planted in that impossible one-booted stance. In the military, we are taught to look for movement. The human eye is naturally drawn to the shift of a uniform or the flash of a bayonet. But this thing was more still than the earth itself. It didn't oppose. Breathe. It didn't oppose. Blink. It didn't oppose. Sway with the wind that was now whistling through the splintered stumps. It was a monument to the void, a physical manifestation of the silence that follows a massacre. End quote, Private, help me, end quote.
The voice came from behind me.
I spun around, my hand going to my holster, but it was just Klaus. He was huddled in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest. The pale, translucent quality of his skin was worsening. By the dim light of the lantern, I could see through his hand. I could actually see the grain of the wooden crate behind his palm. He wasn't oppose. Bleeding, he wasn't oppose. Screaming, but he was disappearing. He was being erased, one layer of reality at a time. End quote. It's looking at me, Sergeant, end quote, Klaus whispered, his voice sounding like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. End quote, even through the walls. I can feel it looking at the place where my shadow used to be. It's measuring the hole I'm leaving behind, end quote. I turned back to the periscope. The entity hadn't oppose. Moved an inch, but it felt closer. It's a trick the Swangmu plays on you. Depth perception fails, and the world flattens into a single terrifying plane. I could see the matte black eyes now, even through the cracked lens of the periscope. They weren't oppose. Eyes so much as absences of light, 2 points of perfect darkness that seemed to pull the silver moonlight into them and never let it out. There was no malice in that gaze, no hatred. There was only a cold, industrial hunger, the same hunger the Somme had for the youth of Europe. I reached for the field telephone again, a desperate, irrational hope that someone somewhere would answer with a voice that didn't oppose. Sound like a dead man. I cranked the handle until my palm was raw. Static. The sound of the radio chatter had changed.
It was neapos. Tes voices anymore.
It was the sound of a heartbeat, a slow, heavy, wet thud that vibrated through the casing of the phone and into the bones of my arm. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the shadowless army's march, now synchronized into a single subterranean pulse. The entity outside began to change. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to tilt its head to the right. It was a movement that defied the structure of a human neck. It kept tilting until its ear was resting on its shoulder, and then it kept going, the bone and sinew of the borrowed Klaus neck twisting like a wet rope. Throughout the entire process, it never took those black voids of eyes off the OP. It was observing me, studying the way I breathed, the way I clutched my rifle, the way I cast a shadow against the sandbags. End quote. The shadow is the weight, end quote. The vibration returned, louder this time, shaking the dust from the timber beams. End quote. Without the weight, the man drifts. With the weight, the land is satisfied.
Give us encore. Sergent. Let the boy go into the mist echo.
I realized then that the entity was Ndapos, there to kill me in the traditional sense. It was waiting for me to surrender. It was waiting for the psychological pressure of the night, the distorted time, and the sight of my fading friend to break my will. If I looked away, if I stepped out of the light, or if I simply gave up the belief that I was a solid living thing, my shadow would slide away just as Elias's and Klaus's had. I was the last man in the grid coordinates who still had a silhouette, and I was holding the entire reality of the sector together by the sheer force of my own terror. I looked at my own shadow on the floor. It was small, huddled under the weak light of the lantern, but it was mine. It was dark and sharp and grounded. I looked at Klaus, who was now little more than a smudge of gray in the corner. His breathing had stopped, but he was Ndapos, dead. He was just empty. Suddenly, the entity outside stood perfectly upright again, its head snapping back into position with a sound like a dry branch breaking. It raised its right hand and pointed directly at the OP. Behind it, the hundreds of shadowless soldiers all did the same. A forest of gray-clad arms, all pointing at me. The Swangmu surged, a massive wave of white vapor that slammed into the OP, extinguishing the lantern and plunging us into a darkness that felt like cold, wet wool. In that absolute blackness, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was cold. It was dry. And it was wearing the fabric of a standard-issue greatcoat.
Echo, Don et Apos. Théorie, Sergent, Echo. A voice whispered in my ear.
It was my own voice. And quote, I and Apos, LL take the watch from here.
You look tired.
You look like you're ready to drift and quote. The cold hand on my shoulder was more than a physical touch, it was an invitation to stop existing. In that absolute stifling darkness of the OP, the hand didn't Apos, feel like flesh and bone. It felt like a void, a pocket of absolute zero that was drawing the heat and the history right out of my body. The voice, my own voice, was Ndapos, just a mimicry anymore. It was an echo of a person I was beginning to forget. Every memory of home, the smell of the English countryside, the sound of my father's laugh, all of it was being recategorized as in quote, baggage and quote, something that was preventing me from merging with the Swangmu. I could feel my shadow, that last bit of in quote, weight and quote, on the floor, sliding toward the boots of the thing standing behind me. It felt like a physical tearing, a spiritual amputation. My legs felt light, almost buoyant, as if I were about to float away from the chalk floor and drift out over no man and Apos' land like a discarded scrap of paper. The entity was right. I was tired. The psalm had been a grinding, relentless nightmare for months, and the promise of a weightless, silent existence in the fog was becoming dangerously seductive. And quote, let it go, Sergeant, and quote, the voice whispered, the breath cold against my ear, smelling of that ancient sterile dust.
Echo. The Waris over in the mist.
No more iron. No more mud.
Just the shadow. Just the peace echo.
But then I felt the small blackened fragment of lightning struck wood in my tunic pocket, the one Baptiste had given me. It was a sharp, jagged edge that pressed against my ribs, a reminder of the solid, unforgiving world of matter. That small piece of oak was a relic of a tree that had survived the elements only to be forged by fire. It was real. It was heavy. And it belonged to the earth, not the air. With a surge of primal, desperate energy, I threw my shoulder back, breaking the contact with the cold hand. I didn't Ndapos, reach for my pistol. I reached for the flare pistol that I had discarded on the table.
My finge found the heavy brass frame.
I didn't Ndapos, aim it at the entity. I knew by now that the end quote, borrowed and quote, forms were immune to our lead. I aimed it at the ceiling of the OP, at the very timber and sandbags that were supposed to protect us.
He pulled the trigger.
The thump of the launch was immediately followed by a roar of magnesium-white fire. The flare didn't Ndapos, have room to fly. It hit the overhead timber and burst into a blinding, chaotic spray of sparks and white-hot light. The interior of the OP was instantly transformed into a furnace of brilliance. The swangmu that had filled the room didn't oppose. Just dissipate, it shrieked. It was a sound I'll never forget, a high-pitched metallic keening like a saw hitting a nail. In that momentary, artificial sun, the entity behind me was revealed. It wasn't oppose, man. It was a column of gray roiling vapor that was desperately trying to hold the shape of my greatcoat. Its face was a shifting, faceless blur, struggling to resolve into my features, but failing under the intensity of the phosphorus glare. As the light hit it, the thing recoiled, its form fraying at the edges like a piece of cloth thrown into a fire. I grabbed my Henderson Field, the wood of the stock hot from the proximity of the flare.
He stepped out of the OP, into the narrow fire trench.
The swangmu outside was churning, reacting to the burst of light from the dugout. The army of the shadowless was still there, but they were no longer a cohesive rank. They were flickering, their forms destabilizing as the diagnostic hold of the moonlight was broken by the chaotic flickering fire from the OP. I raised the rifle. My eyes were watering from the smoke and the glare, but I saw the Klaus entity standing near the wire. It was no longer pointing. It was clutching its head, its borrowed face twisting in an expression of pure existential agony. It wasn't oppose, just the light, it was the fact that I had refused the borrowing. I had reasserted my own weight. Get out of my sector. I roared, the sound of my own voice finally sounding solid again.
He fired a shot.
Not a aimed shot at the chest, but a warning shot, a high-velocity .303 round that whistled just inches above the entity's head. The report of the rifle was a thunderclap that shattered the artificial silence of the night. The sound echoed off the chalk walls and rolled across no man and oppose. S-land, a defiant mechanical scream of the living world. The effect was instantaneous. The moment the sound of the gunshot hit the swangmu, the entire scene collapsed. The hundreds of shadowless soldiers didn't oppose, run, they simply vanished, as if someone had blown out a candle. The glowing fog turned a dull, flat gray and began to recede with a sound like a long, indrawn breath. The Klaus entity looked at me one last time, its matte black eyes wide with something that might have been surprise, and then it too dissolved into a swirl of white vapor that was sucked into the earth. The silence that followed was different. It was the natural heavy silence of the psalm, the sound of the distant war returning to my ears. I could hear the rhythmic thud of the howitzers again. I could hear the drip of water. I could hear the scratching of rats. The pressure in the air was gone. I stood there for a long time, my rifle still at my shoulder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I waited for the flare in the OP to burn itself out. When the light finally faded to a dull red glow, I stepped back into the hole. Klaus was still in the corner. He was solid again. His uniform had regained its color, and he was breathing deep, shuddering breaths of a man who had been underwater for too long. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and terrified, but they were his eyes. I looked at the floor at his feet. His shadow was back, a faint dark smudge against the chalk, flickering in the dying light of the phosphorus. Is it over? Klaus rasped. For tonight, I said, my voice shaking. I needed to see the spot where the entity had stood. I climbed over the parapet, ignoring the protocol, and walked the 5 yards to the wire. The moon was still out, but it was just a moon now, a cold rock in the sky. I found the exact grid coordinate where the thing with Klaus's face had been standing. The mud there was disturbed, but not by a platoon of men. There were no tracks of an army. There was no sign of a struggle. There was only a single footprint. It was a right boot, the hobnails clearly defined in the silt. But as I leaned closer with my torch, I saw that the mud inside the print was bone-dry and cracked, as if a localized fire had burned away every drop of moisture. It was the only mark on the entire field, a single solitary sign of something that had tried to walk into our world without a shadow. The victory in the orchard was a fragile, fleeting thing. As Klaus and I retreated from the wire and descended back into the deep dugout of the Thiepval sector, the air didn't oppose, feel lighter, It felt compressed, as if the entire weight of the psalm was pressing down on the timber rafters. We had reached the secondary line, a reinforced concrete and earth bunker that sat 20 feet below the surface. This was supposed to be the safest place in the sector, a fortress against the 15-inch howitzers, but as we sealed the heavy steel door, I realized we hadn't oppose. T escaped the Swangmu. We had simply trapped ourselves inside with it. The fog was no longer a mist outside. It was seeping through the ventilation shafts, coiling around the support beams like a living thing, thin and white and smelling of ozone. We were alone. The other men of the unit were stationed further down the line or were lost in the temporal distortions of the night. It was just me, Klaus, and a single flickering paraffin lamp that sat on the center of a scarred wooden table. Klaus was sitting on a bunk, his head in his hands, his shadow cast long and jagged against the concrete wall. My own shadow sat beside his, a dark, solid shape that felt like the only real thing left in the world. We were in a state of high alert, our rifles across our laps, but the enemy wasn't oppose. T coming through the door. The enemy was coming from the light itself. The lamp began to sputter. Every time the flame dipped, the shadows on the wall would stretch and pulse, their edges fraying into the gray vapor of the Swangmu. I noticed that the shadows of the timber braces weren't oppose. T matching the physical beams anymore. On the wall, the shadows of the wood looked like the crooked reaching arms of the shadowless army we had seen in No Man and Oppo's land. The silence was absolute, yet my ears were ringing with that high-pitched metallic frequency, the sound of the borrowing process starting again. And quote, "They're inside the walls," and quote, Klaus whispered, not looking up. And quote, "I can hear them breathing in the chalk."
They don't oppose. They want the bunker, sergent.
They just want the light to go out, and quote. I checked my watch. 2:45. The hands were still frozen, but the ticking had become a rhythmic thumping that seemed to be coming from the floor beneath our boots. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the one-booted march, amplified by the hollow spaces beneath the bunker. The and quote, Kumuonbong and quote, were right under us, waiting for the paraffin to fail. I looked at the lamp. The reservoir was nearly empty. I had perhaps 10 minutes of light left before we were plunged into the absolute darkness where the shadow and the man are indistinguishable. The first manifestation occurred at 2:50. My shadow, cast against the far wall, began to move independently of my body. I was sitting perfectly still, but the shadow raised its hand and began to trace the grid coordinates etched into the concrete. It moved with a fluid, graceful precision that I didn't oppose, T possess. It wasn't oppose, T my reflection anymore. It was a tenant, a spirit that was preparing to leave the house. I felt a cold, numbing sensation in my fingertips, a feeling of unquote, unpeeling unquote, that started at my skin and moved inward toward the bone. And quote, stay in the light, Klaus. And quote, I shouted, grabbing the lamp and holding it close to my chest. But Klaus didn't oppose, T move. He was staring at his own shadow. His shadow was no longer a silhouette of a man. It had transformed into the shape of the entity from the orchard, the one with the distorted face and the matte black eyes. The shadow entity on the wall leaned toward Klaus, its dark hand reaching out to touch his head. As the shadow hand touched the shadow head, Klaus's physical body began to vibrate. He wasn't oppose, T shaking from fear. He was being harmonized with the frequency of the Swangmu. His form became blurred, his uniform losing its texture until he looked like a charcoal sketch that had been rubbed with a damp cloth. The paraffin lamp gave one final, violent flicker and died. The darkness that followed was not the absence of light, it was a physical weight. It was cold, wet, and smelled of the dry dust of the dead. In that blackness, the siege began in earnest. I couldn't oppose, T.C. Klaus, but I could hear him drifting. I could hear the sound of his soul being pulled out of his body, a long, slow unquote, hiss unquote, like air escaping a balloon. I felt the entity behind me again, its presence a void of heat and sound. It didn't oppose, T need to speak this time. It was simply there, a gravity well that was pulling my shadow away from my boots. I reached into my pocket and found the fragment of lightning-struck oak.
I gript it so hard the splinter drew blood.
The pain was a grounding wire, a reminder that I was made of flesh and that flesh was separate from the mist. I didn't oppose, pray, I didn't oppose, scream. I simply focused on the weight of the wood and the copper tang of my own blood. I refused to be a memory. I refused to be a map for the hungry land. The thumping beneath the floor reached a crescendo, a deafening roar of rhythmic footsteps that shook the very foundations of the bunker. The walls seemed to dissolve, the concrete turning into the gray vapor of the Somme. For a moment I wasn't oppose, in a bunker at all. I was standing in the middle of a vast white void, surrounded by thousands of shadowless men, all of them waiting for me to step into their ranks. The entity wearing my face stood before me, its hand outstretched. End quote. The night is long, end quote. The voice vibrated inside my brain. End quote. But the fog is forever.
Give up the weight, and you will never feel the mud again echo.
I squeezed the oak fragment until the wood cracked. End quote. No, end quote, I whispered. It was the smallest sound, but in that void, it was a thunderclap. Suddenly, a faint gray light began to bleed through the ventilation shafts. It wasn't oppose, the silver light of the moon or the magnesium white of a flare. It was the first cold light of dawn, the sun rising over the ruined hills of Picardy. The effect was like acid on the Swang Mu. The white void shattered, the walls of the bunker slammed back into place, and the pressure in my ears vanished with a sharp, painful pop. I was back in the dugout. The paraffin lamp was cold and dead on the table. Klaus was slumped on the bunk, unconscious but solid. I looked at the floor. My shadow was there, dark and anchored to my boots, as faithful as ever. The Swang Mu had retreated, leaving only a thin, harmless mist on the floor that smelled of wet chalk and nothing more. The siege was over. We were relieved at 6 o'clock by a fresh squad from the 14th Battalion. They found us sitting in silence, staring at the wall. When the lieutenant asked for our report, I handed him a standard SITREP, end quote, grid coordinate 44B secure.
Minimal enemy activity.
Unusual atmospheric conditions noted. End quote. I didn't oppose, mentioned the army of the shadowless. I didn't oppose, mentioned the man who had lost his weight. In the army, you learn quickly which truths are allowed to exist and which ones are meant to stay buried in the mud. Klaus was never the same. He was sent back to the rear for, end quote, shell shock, end quote, but whenever I saw him before his discharge, he was always standing in the brightest sunlight he could find, staring at his own shadow with a look of intense, desperate suspicion. He lived the rest of his life as if he were a guest in his own skin, always checking the ground to make sure his anchor was still holding. As for me, I still have the piece of lightning-struck oak. And on some nights, when the fog rolls in across the fields of England and the silence becomes a bit too heavy, I find myself looking at my shadow. Sometimes, just for a second, I see it flicker. Sometimes, it looks like it's trying to stand up and walk away. This is the reality of the Somme that they don and oppose, teach in the academies.
Zoari SN et Apos. T'es juste a conflict of nation, it's a harvest of the soul.
If you've ever stood watch in the mist and felt your own weight start to drift, you know what I'm talking about. The land is still there, and it is still hungry. Tonight, the smoke pit is cooling down, and the stories are retreating back into the darkness. But I wonder, has anyone else here ever looked at their shadow and seen something that didn't oppose, belong to them? The events at the Somme in 1916 remain one of the most documented yet least understood chapters of the Great War. While the history books focus on the strategic failures and the staggering loss of life, the private journals of the men who held the line tell a different story, a story of a landscape that turned against the living. The end quote, shadow borrowers end quote, of Picardy have never been officially acknowledged, yet the reports of end quote, phantom infiltrators end quote, and end quote, spontaneous identity loss end quote, persist in the restricted archives of both the Allied and Central Powers. The war ended in 1918, but for those who encountered the Swang Mu at grid coordinate 44B, the conflict never truly ceased. They carried the cold of the orchard in their bones and the weightlessness of the shadowless in their spirits. It is a reminder that in the theater of war, the greatest casualties are often the ones that cannot be counted on a casualty list. Some men lost their lives, but others lost the very thing that made them human, their connection to the physical world. As you sit here tonight, far from the mud and the wire, remember that some places on this earth have seen too much blood to ever truly be at peace. The fog still rolls across the Somme every summer, and the moon still casts its diagnostic light across the craters. If you ever find yourself in those quiet, haunted places, keep your light bright and your shadow close.
Do not let the silence fool you into thinking you are alone.
We have shared our reports from the forgotten front. Now, the perimeter is yours to hold. If you have encountered the things that dwell in the gaps of history, the voices that mimic your own, the shadows that move in the dark, now is the time to speak. The smoke pit is always open for those who have seen the world for what it truly is. Would you like me to explore another classified event from the Pacific theater of World War II, perhaps involving the legends of the Solomon Islands?